My name is Kayla Brennan, and I'm the Education and Development Coordinator for NACA. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Steve Westbrook, the Vice President for University Affairs at Stephen F. Austin State University. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him. But throughout the webinar, if you haven't been with us before, the best way to engage and communicate is going to be through the chat function. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put those in the chat.
Okay, Kayla, thank you. Hope everybody can hear me fine. And welcome to those of you that have logged in and let me know that you're here. I know some of you out there, so it's good to see you sort of electronically today. We're going to have our session today on reporting and decision making based upon the way we're doing our assessment. And I want to share with you a little bit where I'm coming from as I do the presentation today. So let's get started with that. A little bit about me and where I'm coming from. I've been in the field for 35 years, so I've seen assessment kind of move through various phases over the time that I've been working in the field of student affairs. I'm at Stephen F. Austin State University, as Kayla said. We're a comprehensive regional institution with a little over 12,600 students. We're a highly residential campus, about 5,100 residential students, and I've been in the current role that I'm in as vice president for 10 years now. So that's the direction that I'm going to come from as we talk about reporting and decision making and the use of assessment in helping institutional decision makers with their work. I think we need to ask the question, or start with the question of why. Why does the way we communicate what we may have learned through assessment impact its usefulness on decision making? And then why is that question more critical to decision makers than ever? Well, first of all, I think we are all familiar with a lot of the headlines that we're seeing throughout the media. And these headlines are simply reflective of what a lot of the public feel today about higher education in general. For instance, The Economist asked the question, is college even worth it? It talks about degrees being a waste of money and that the return on education would be better if college were cheaper. NPR had a session on how the cost of college went from affordable to sky high, which again begins to add to this idea, is college worth it? USA Today asks the question again, is college worth it? And then it quotes Goldman Sachs as saying not so much. PBS NewsHour talks about how higher education can it evolve to be affordable. The Chronicle of Higher Ed asks if we've reached a tipping point. All of these things are really important as we begin to consider how impactful our assessment can be. Now, I know that many of you have gone through the other sessions in the webinar series and looked at how to develop assessment and how to make assessment work within your programs. What I really want to concentrate on today is how to connect assessment to priorities that may be statewide or institution-wide. And again, why is that important? I believe it's very important because higher education is more pressed than ever to provide that there's value to be had by attending college. So institutions are more focused on outcomes than ever. And so we have to rethink the way we communicate the evidence that we have, the value our programs add to a student's experience. Therefore, for institutional decision makers, it's very important that we align our assessment with institutional priorities. The question might be raised, again, starting with why, about why. Why should we align our assessment with institutional priorities? There's this quote out of the Change magazine recently that talks about this, and I've broken this down on the next slide into a couple of elements. One is we need to focus on improving performance within available resources while maintaining quality. Now, the way that I characterize that a lot is there's just more to do than there is to do with. Um, the next element within that article is the lack of good data hampers the ability to achieve ends and interferes with the ability of states and boards and other constituencies to understand their performance. Now, we can interpret that to say we must have evidence of the value that's added to the student experience by our programs, and we must communicate that evidence in the language of our audience. The next element out of that article is without this information, institutional managers simply cannot make wise decisions, and I think that needs no explanation. So as we start with the reason, or starting with why, as we look at the idea of reporting and decision making, what we learn through our assessment efforts, I think we have to expand our thinking about assessment and make sure that we connect it to the things that are important to the institution. We have some hurdles within student affairs. Student affairs programs and services are sometimes more nuanced than academic programs, and they can be perceived as difficult to assess sometimes. I think some of this really boils down to how we have structured our assessment. And you've been looking at that. Those of you that have participated in the previous webinars have been able to source through that a little bit and determine how to ensure that you are assessing those things that matter. Practitioners in student affairs sometimes are untrained because we really don't have a history within the field of mandatory program assessment. And sometimes simply that inexperience that may be out there, coupled with the heavy workloads that we have, can just equal gloom, like this poor puppy, sad. However, I'm going to invite you to cheer up, because you probably have what you need already to demonstrate your impact. And we're going to work through that a little bit today. First of all, what really matters? To really make the greatest difference, the evidence of impact that you collect through your assessment must be communicated and tied directly to what matters to your institution. And it's important to use the vocabulary of the audience that you are communicating with. Earlier this morning, I was just in a session with university leaders from around the state who convened on our campus, and we were looking at how we assess and communicate the impact that co-curricular and extracurricular programs have on the development of marketable skills within students. And there's kind of this common agreement that generally we're not really keen on the term marketable skills. Many of us use the term career readiness skills. Some faculty don't like the term career readiness skills or marketable skills. But the fact is, the assessment that in the audience for our assessment in this particular area is our statewide higher education coordinating board, who has determined that marketable skills is an area of emphasis within the statewide strategic plan. So we have to make sure that when we are communicating what we are learning through our assessment to that particular audience, that we use a vocabulary that they understand and that's important to them. Because as we report out our assessment findings, the more we have to explain to our audience what we mean by by the terms that we use, more that gets lost in the translation there. So I would invite you to be mindful as you report the evidence of impact that your programs are having on student development, that you think about the audience that you are reporting to, and use the vocabulary that is impactful to them, even if it's maybe something that is not so intuitive to you. But we want to make sure that we're not having to translate too much, or sometimes things get lost in translation, as we know. Okay, let me see if I can advance. Here we go. Sometimes we miss the mark when we do this. Sometimes the assessment that we conduct is only for our internal consumption. Now, what I'm going to challenge you to think about today is how we expand the scope of our assessment when we conduct it, because as we're talking about reporting and decision making based on this, the focus that I have on the decision making piece is how your assessment can connect your program to the priorities that the institution has, so that the institutional decision makers can feel comfortable that your programs are contributing to what the institution is trying to achieve. So it's perfectly fine and probably expected that you have a lot of internal consumption assessment, because you're using that assessment many times to improve your programs. So you're closing the loop. You are conducting some program, or you are providing some service. You are assessing the effectiveness of that. You're taking what you learn from that assessment, and you're improving the program or service, closing the loop, and you're starting that over again. That works really, really great to make sure that your programs are efficient and effective. What I want to talk about today, though, is how we connect those things to the larger audience. Sometimes the metrics that we use can really work to determine if our programs are being successful, but they don't really work well when we communicate the impact that we have on the strategic priorities of the state and or the institution. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can map our data to institutional priorities. First of all, there's three pretty easy steps, I think, here. First step is rather intuitive. You need to select an institutional goal or priority. Now this is, I'm going to have a little question later about how many of you are familiar with what those are, but select an institutional goal or priority. And then the second step is simply to identify the units, the programs, or the services that you're working with that impact that goal or priority. And then the third step is simple. For each of those programs or services that you've identified, just target several metrics that capture the impact that's made by those programs or services on that particular goal or priority. So let's talk about landing the plan or the plane. If you start your descent at about 50,000 square feet, we'll begin to land this plane step by step by step. First of all, think big. As you think about what you are doing in your particular area within the university. Think big about how it connects to the priorities, either of your institution or all the way up to statewide priorities. Sometimes I think we limit ourselves in student affairs. We don't. We may think about institutional priorities, but we may not be reaching into state priorities as well. Now, we would hope that institutional priorities reflect state priorities, but sometimes we need to be able to communicate to both, and they may be different audiences that we have to communicate to slightly differently. So as we look at this, we look at statewide priorities to start with, then we look at institutional priorities, and then we'll look at program priorities. So let's just kind of track a program assessment. and connect it to both statewide and institutional priorities. And I hope I can show you how we can thread all of this together, and how I think it's probably easier than we may think sometime to find the hooks that our programs and services can connect to these priorities. And I'll tell you why that's very important, because institutional decision makers are tasked often with making sure that the programs and services that are within their purview are addressing what is considered to be the priorities of the institution or the state. We need evidence of that. So we're going to be looking to our program directors. We're going to be looking to our unit directors. We're going to be looking to those that manage our services within our divisions for that evidence. It's important that we also know that you are conducting you're conducting assessment within your areas to determine that you are effective as possible in delivering the program and service that you are delivering. But we also need to better understand how we can articulate how what you are doing connects to the priorities of the institution or the state. So let's think big here. Let's look at statewide priorities. Kayla, let's go ahead and do the first poll on statewide priorities there. Just take a minute and give me some indication of how aware you are of what your state's higher education strategic priorities are. I'm just interested to know if this is something that the audience has an awareness of, or not so much. We'll have a moment of awkward silence here while you vote. Now, Kayla, help me out. Well, I see the results there. All right, so the majority are saying somewhat, some not at all, and some aren't even sure if the state has any strategic priorities. That doesn't surprise me, because I think sometimes we aren't really tuned in to statewide priorities. I would challenge you to take a look at that. If nothing else, it gives you a discussion point when you're visiting with supervisors, or you're visiting with decision makers on your campus, to have an awareness of the priorities that they are being tasked with addressing. Because as often as you can tie the assessment and the evidence of impact that you have within your particular program and area to those things that your decision makers on your campus are being tasked with addressing, it's going to make their job a lot easier. They'll have a bigger smile on their face, and it's also going to make sure that what you're doing aligns very vertically with what the institution is being asked to do statewide. I want to use an example. In Texas, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board last summer adopted a 15-year strategic plan. It's called 60 by 30 Texas. The reason 60 by 30 is its title is its overarching goal is by 2030, the goal is that 60% of Texans between the ages of 25 and 34 would have a post-secondary credential. It has three other goals in the plan. It's a very targeted and focused plan. But what I want to give an example of how a statewide plan can flow into an institutional priority and can flow into a departmental and unit priority. Just want to show the connection between all of that and how the assessment that can be done at a unit level really can help to feed an institution's ability to show evidence that it is addressing a statewide plan. And when that happens, your particular unit or department is going to be very connected to what is considered the priorities throughout the institution and the state. And that's what we're all after in the long run, is to make sure we're all focused and pulling in the same direction. And what I want you to be able to feel when you're done and you make these connections is that you know very well that what you're doing every day has a direct connection with what the expectations are, not only at the institutional level, but the state level. The third goal of this particular statewide strategic plan is this marketable skills goal. And it's by 2030, all graduates from Texas public institutions of higher ed will have completed programs with identified marketable skills. And then it has some narrative under there, but what I want to highlight is that last phrase, because what they recognize here is that these skills can be acquired through curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular activities. So all of a sudden, by someone just being aware that this is a statewide priority, and we hear the term co-curricular and extracurricular activities, we know we have a hook there. And so we need to drill down and say, okay, if marketable skills is a statewide goal, and there's already a recognition that those can be acquired through co-curricular and extracurricular programs in addition to the curriculum, then how do we begin to demonstrate or show evidence of our impact in that through our assessment efforts? So then we drill down into institutional priorities. So let's run the second poll. It's very similar to the first one that we did. How many of you are aware of what your institution's strategic priorities are? We'll take just a moment of awkward silence again as you respond to this poll. All right, we have a majority somewhat, and a good number of very aware, and that's great because, like I mentioned before, I think that you would expect that your institutional priorities would already be tied to statewide priorities. So I think it's important for you to be aware of what your statewide priorities are. That's just good to know. But your institutional priorities is where your primary focus can be. And when we can connect vertically all of those, it's just going to make more sense for us. So as we move on, let me get into an institutional priority role. Here at my university, we just adopted last summer as well a new strategic plan. It's odd, it's kind of an 8-year plan. There's a reason to that. 2023 will celebrate our 100th anniversary, so it's tied to that. But here are our goals. We have an overarching goal of transformative experiences for our students, and a foundational goal of enrollment growth, and then there's 4 operational goals. One of the goals is to foster academic and co-curricular innovation, and one of the strategies within that goal ties directly to the marketable skills goal that the state has, and that is our institutional goal, our strategy is to infuse career development experiences throughout a student's curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular experience while they're at SFA. Now, there was no coincidence that ties very closely to the development of marketable skills within students through a student's curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular experience. So we have connection vertically between the institution and the statewide priorities. But now we drill down even deeper, and we look at how we do that career development integration. And I'm going to highlight strategy number 4 here. Well, strategy number 4 within this career development integration piece is to collect assessment of student learning that can support compliance with the marketable skills initiative of the statewide plan and also align with core assessment. So again, we're threading all of these things together. An institutional priority that supports a statewide priority, and then one of the strategies is to assess that and be able to report the evidence of the impact that we're having. Now let's talk about departmental priorities, because now we're beginning to land the plane, right? We started at 50,000 square feet, and then we moved into a little bit lower as we began to hit the runway, and now we're at departmental priorities. So let's take this quick poll about how aware you are of your department's strategic priorities. I hope nobody can click the first bullet on that one. Okay, well, we have one that doesn't know if their department has strategic priorities. That's going to make things harder to be able to connect assessment to what the priorities of your department and all the way up to through your institution to the state. Somewhat and very aware, and I think those are expected. I would hope that as you move through and you do your assessment, that you are able to determine very clearly what your department's strategic priorities are, and hopefully they're tied to your institution's strategic priorities. That's going to be important when we talk about, again, the whole title of this particular session is reporting and decision making. So decision making is going to be critical that it's addressing or that the assessment results address some priority, so it's useful in decision making. Let's look at how we drilled this down even further. Evidence. What is the evidence of career development integration? So we determined that we need evidence of career development integration. So we take a department here, which is our Student Affairs Department. We take the unit, which is the Dean of Student Affairs. The program is Project CEO. And the metric that we used within, and CEO is an acronym for co-curricular experiences outcomes. The metric here is a measure of students' awareness of what they were learning from co-curricular experiences, and each of the 10 skills that employers indicate they want the most from a new college graduate in an annual study that's conducted by the National Association of Colleges and Employers, or NACE. We began looking at this several years ago to determine the impact that our co-curricular programs were having on a student's acquisition of the skills that employers tell us that they look for most in graduates. This predates the marketable skills, the statewide marketable skills goal. So it was very fortunate for us that we already had some things underway in measuring this. So as we looked at this, just take a look at how this begins to flow. You've learned in the last few sessions on how to develop those assessment pieces, but what I wanted to look at is show you how we report this out. So when we're talking about reporting and decision making, when we reported out the Project CEO evidence of what percentage of our students indicate that they gained those skills in college, or from our experiences, we were able to demonstrate that in most cases, our students were gaining the skills that employers say that they were most important to them by participating in co-curricular experiences on our campus. Now, I will tell you that one of the things that I've asked for as a decision maker is more direct evidence of this, more direct assessment of this. This is sort of the evidence of students' perception of whether they've gained these skills. So now we're moving into a phase of collecting evidence here by using interview stream, where we actually ask students to articulate how they have gained these skills, because part of what we are also trying to measure is how well our students are able to actually not only understand that they've gained these skills, but articulate their acquisition of these particular skills to potential employers. So it's just sort of evidence of how reporting becomes very important to decision makers on campus. And as we're making decisions about how we allocate resources, how we support programs, because remember back to an earlier slide where we had the little phrase, there's more to do than there is to do with. Decision makers on your campus are faced with this all of the time. There has to be a prioritization of programs and services. Those that can provide evidence of the greatest impact that address priorities that the institution has established are likely going to be those programs and services that are going to receive the best consideration. So that's why I think it's important, even though you may be doing assessment within your departments and looking at programs and services and in their delivery sort of within just the context of your department or your program or service, it's really going to be key every time that you can to educate yourself on what all of the institutional and statewide priorities are, and determine, are there ways that you can assess what you are doing with students every day. And remember, a lot of assessment is nothing more than just providing evidence of what we do all the time and the impact that it's having. It's not doing anything new generally. It's just providing evidence of why what we do is making a difference in the lives of our students. Sometimes I use the phrase that if a student went through our university and never accessed your program or service, what would they have missed? And if you have a hard time answering that question, what would they have missed? I think you need to evaluate what you're doing. You need to be able to articulate if a student does not access this particular program or service, here is the value added to their experience that they missed through the time that they were here. It's kind of a reverse way of asking the question, what do we add? Just ask yourself sometimes, if a student didn't do this, what would they have missed? But if you look at the slide that's up now, these are the type of metrics that begin to speak to decision makers, because it provides a way for a person like me to represent my departments and my division well in a discussion about the importance of what we do within student affairs all the time. It is evidence of impact, and that's directly connected to an institutional priority. So I think it's important as you work through your assessment work every semester and every year, that you seek ways to connect what you're doing to those institutional priorities. Our evidence in this particular area showed that the students who were involved in one or more organizations were probably gaining skills at a higher rate than those that were involved in or were less involved. It also showed that the quantity of involvement opportunities were an influential factor. We found that students who were more involved in multiple organizations reported that they gained these skills at a higher rate than any other student. And so it's something that we can use to provide evidence to students, to faculty, to parents, and to decision makers of the importance of student involvement on our campus. We all intuitively know that. In our heart of hearts, we know it, but now we have evidence that we can use to back up what we've always known is true. So we land the plane here. We have the statewide priority of marketable skills. We have the institutional priority of integrating career development into all years of a student's experience. We have the program priority of ensuring that students are aware of the marketable skills that are enhanced through their involvement in co-curricular activities and are able to articulate their acquisition of those skills to prospective employers. And then we have the evidence of that student involvement in the programs offered through the Office of Student Engagement, which were the ones measured, enhance the involved students' ability to recognize and articulate the acquisition of marketable skills sought by employers. So we've had a vertical connection all the way from the Office of Student Engagement up through the statewide higher education strategic plan. Anytime that you can do that, you've got a winner on your hands. If you can't connect all the way to the statewide priorities, try to make sure that you are very much addressing institutional priorities. You would hope that your departmental priorities are connected very closely to institutional priorities. So if you aren't familiar with your institutional priorities, at least make yourself familiar with the departmental priorities. For those of you that aren't aware of any of those, your lack of awareness may be the fact that you simply haven't made yourself aware, or no one's made you aware of those, or it may be that they just aren't articulated well, and you just wouldn't be able to make yourself aware of that. Everybody's going to be in a little bit different position there, but I would encourage you to dig deep, ask some questions, try to make sure that you're aligning at least part of your assessment with those things that the institution have identified as priorities for it. We come back to a diagram that you have seen several times as you've gone through this webinar series that looks at the whole assessment process. And let's go back to the bottom block there where we look at the institutional strategic plan. We added in this session a statewide strategic plan, which then you hope would flow into the institutional strategic plan, which would then flow into a divisional and a departmental plan. And then you begin to look at your assessment priorities and work all the way up the line until you're able to evaluate. So again, from the standpoint of a division head, those areas that are doing assessment that help feed the information to me, that help me make the great argument that our programs and services are providing transformative experiences for our students in ways that impact institutional priorities and in some ways statewide priorities. It makes my job much easier, and it makes the allocation of resources an easier task because we're able to put our money where our mouth is in those ways. And for those programs and services that aren't able to make those connections, or simply don't make those connections well, or they may not make those connections in the language of those that want to hear those, it's a taller task for them. So in the long run, take a look at the external audience that you want to speak to through your assessment results. Sometimes that's going to mean taking the next step beyond where you're comfortable with assessment now. You've been participating likely in this whole webinar series because you're interested in sort of becoming more comfortable with conducting assessment. So for me to take you to a leap of connecting that to statewide higher education strategic priorities is a pretty tall step to jump. So don't worry about that, because what I'm trying to just get across is that anytime that you can, make those connections. And I think most of the time you have what you need to do that right at your fingertips. It's just a matter of being able to think outside the box a little bit and make those connections. It's going to mean, I think, sometimes reframing the way that you are looking at a particular assessment metric, or it may mean changing your vocabulary a little bit when you're reporting that. Again, this session is on reporting and decision making. Vocabulary is very important. I ask my departments when they report out a lot of their assessment results to give it to me in terms that I can immediately and quickly compile and use to provide evidence of impact of all of our divisional programs. So using common language and common terminology is very important, because otherwise I have to sort of do a lot of interpretation and weave all of this together myself, and that just makes it more difficult for me to do. And I really like those departments that flow right into that, and their assessment matches up very nicely. We produce an annual report called Beyond the Classroom Report, where we are able to provide evidence of our impact across the campus. So we've kind of stumbled along and found our way to do that. I would encourage you to stumble along. It's not going to be elegant all the time, but ask your supervisors, ask those that you report to what language they would like it in. If they want it in Greek, write it in Greek. If they want it in Spanish, write it in Spanish. Just learn to do that. It's not going to come all at once. It comes through doing it over and over. It's just like we assess any program. Do it, learn from it, improve, and do it again. And I think in the long run, when you're able to do that, and that's why you've been going through this webinar series, is to better equip yourself to do that, then you're going to have an advantage over those departments, programs, and services that are less able to do that. So with that, I'm going to kind of go into question mode here. And if you have any questions, let's just throw them out there. Kayla, we just throw them on the chat. Is that right?
Yes, if you have any questions at this time, you can put those in the chat, and we'll hang around for a few minutes just in case we get some questions. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you, Steve, so much for your time today. And thank you, everyone who attended. I hope you really got something out of this webinar and the whole series. Unfortunately, this is the conclusion of it, but all webinars have been recorded and will be put on Encore, our digital library, soon. A couple of them already are, but the last two will be added very soon. So like we said, we'll hang around a couple more minutes for questions, but otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, so we'll probably go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you again, Steve.
Thanks, Kayla. Bye, everybody.
Bye.